Hello, everybody. Welcome to our event, Trauma Informed Placemaking, which is guest curated by Dr. Anita Mckeown and Dr. Cara and hosted by the Irish Architecture Foundation as part of the Reimagine Placemaking programme. For those of you new to us, the Irish Architecture Foundation is an organisation that promotes architecture as culture with a broad and innovative programme aimed at supporting your engagement with architecture and to help build a better environment for us to live in. Our Reimagine Placemaking programme helps with these goals and works directly with communities around Ireland, focusing on themes such as town centre revitalisation, inclusive placemaking, age-friendly design and climate justice. Reimagine is funded by the Arts Council, Department of Rural and Community Development, and Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. The Reimagine programme was developed with funding from the Creative Ireland programme's National Creativity Fund. It is a privilege to have this amazing cohort together to discuss this important topic. Anita and Cara will explain more about trauma-informed placemaking, but I will say that this is such an important theme for all of us working in this field to consider. We need to build a better recognition for the impact we have in communities, both negative as well as positive, and create a trauma-informed approach for addressing the work we do. Some housekeeping. This event is being recorded. Due to the large number of attendees expected, your cameras and mics are off. However, we want to encourage your engagement. So use the chat function to chat away. Use the Q&A function to ask questions that we will add and address at the end. And at the end, we should have time to unmute you so we can open up the discussion. And now I will hand over to Anita and Cara to do the proper event introductions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bernadine. Let me now do that clunky bit where I share my screen with you. Give me a moment. Okay, Anita.
Okay, so hello everybody, I'm Anita and you've seen Cara. We're absolutely thrilled to be here with everybody and having the platform to open up this conversation about the Trauma Informed project.
So Anita and I have been working on this for the past 2 years or so, really. It's now from a conversation that we started during lockdown over Zoom. It's now a forthcoming textbook with Routledge, which will be out towards the end of this year. And we have that website there, Trauma Informed Place, which is a really growing resource and sort of rolling stone gathering its moss of a global cohort of people that have this shared concern with us as well. So there's a library of resources and materials sympathetic to the subject on there. And there's also information of everybody, the community, members, the practitioners, the researchers that are part of this textbook as well. And it's growing all the time as well. And what we noticed with this is when we put a call out for people to come and be involved in this, we noticed it sort of gave a name to ways of working that people have been involved in for many years as a practice and as a process. And the book and the cohort reflect that as well, and recognizing this as something that is a trauma-aware practice and a healing-centered approach into their own work as well.
So we advocate for a trauma awareness in placemaking, for people in place to fully comprehend that places are both sites of trauma and that the work they have done and may do could cause trauma as well as healing, and also to say that this is a flip side and just to be mindful. Across the book, we've gathered examples of trauma-informed approaches in the built environment, led by people of those places as a collective healing. We have examples of planning and policymakers to take that trauma-informed approach, and frameworks for working with communities on the trauma towards healing journey. Practitioners are speaking from their first person and reflexive position in their places as Indigenous people or other place professionals. We look at how the arts and creativity can recuperate places and people, whether post-COVID, conditions of gentrification, working with mental and behavioural health services and social workers, and many more. We're also considering how to evaluate and determine success in trauma-informed placemaking projects, how historically marginalised communities take space, make place, create interventions from the perspective of participants and community members, and of this approach as a means to work through traumatizing histories and presence of systemic racism. And we hope this opens up a conversation for all to join in globally, contributing their experience, their practices, and their hopes for the future.
Now, what Anita and I really sort of passionately believe in is this, that we're really aiming to move placemaking and place-based ways of working to having this trauma-informed awareness in their practice. So when we go into a place, this is part of our practice toolkit. And as we touched upon earlier, to recognise the harm that we may, as practitioners, cause, as well, of course, understanding that the places that we work in, they're all real possible sites of historical or contemporary trauma. And of course, they all could become sites of trauma as well, when we think through the lens of protest, climate and ecological emergency, and of course of pandemics as well. So for us, this project and the book itself, and bringing together everybody under this banner of trauma-informed placemaking, is all a call to action for us as place-based practitioners to think more and to think better about our practice and our ethics. So what is our future? How do we practice? What are the principles for trauma that we work to? And how do we want to make that influence as well to other placemakers in our cohort? That's a very quick summation of us. And of course, Anita and I are really happy to talk more about the genesis of the project and our particular purviews into this. But really what we're here to do today as well is celebrate some of those people that are on this, in this cohort with us. So a huge, massive thank you to our wonderful speakers for giving up their time to be with us today. We're going to hear from 5 from our cohorts today. So there's Ashley Rusk talking from the purview of a Belfast setting and a place healing. Cara and Michal talking about an anti-colonial purview. Brian sharing a post-disaster example, and Jeff, who's working with young people in place. Of course, we'll go over to them and they will tell us what they're talking about in much more detail and much better than me. This is the running order for us today. So we'll go through each of the speakers in turn. They have around 10 minutes to speak, and then we've all asked them to come up with some questions to pose to you as audience as well. Those will be within their talk, they'll be within the chat. You can respond to them through the chat, but we'll come back to them once everybody has spoken, and we'll have then an open platform for us all to be talking on this subject. So to start us off, Aisling, it's over to you.
Thank you. Hi there. I now need to also do the awkward screen share thing. Hopefully you can all see that. So thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here and be part of this really important, wide-reaching project. Definitely slight imposter syndrome. I'm really looking forward to hearing all these other fascinating talks and insights. Who am I? I am an architect. I'm director of Studio Inner Architecture Practice in Belfast. And I've been thinking as I prepared to speak today about what made me submit an abstract a year and a half ago when this project started. I grew up outside Belfast. I grew up seeing big walls that were put there to keep people to one side or the other. And as I trained as an architect, I came to look at these walls anew and think about the message they give. You know, if you grow up in their shadow, what kind of monster must you think there is on the other side that needs a wall that big to keep them out? And they just get taller and taller as a brick is thrown over and hits a child playing in their garden. And maybe this happens only once or twice, but the urban legend of that traumatic event means that there's many more wider and taller meters of walls keep going up across the city, even 25 years after the Good Friday Agreement. People living next to these walls don't want them to come down. They think they need them for their safety. So my interest in this and thoughts around this led me to do a PhD, which is exploring how we build connection across both physical and social divides through our practices. I also looked to Israel-Palestine. I should be flicking forward my slides here. And that context where, you can see families being driven apart, farmers separated from their land by a political wall, and Palestinians who are having their homes demolished time and time again. I attended a talk at Trinity in Dublin around about 10 years ago by a feminist Palestinian professor of law called Nadera Shalhoub-Kevorkian, and she was speaking about, among other things, housing demolitions in Palestine. And she described an incident of a family standing, witnessing their home being demolished before their eyes, and the mother taking her children in a hug and telling her this hug, this is home. And that vignette for me is what I think of when I think of trauma-informed placemaking and healing. It may seem strange as an architect that my first thought of placemaking is not a spatial one, but rather an immediate, improvised, ad hoc, but utterly meaningful, as in making meaning, healing response to a traumatic circumstance that puts people and their experience and immediate needs at its centre. Anyway, that is my angle and my interest in trauma-informed placemaking. But I'm not going to talk about anything as dramatic as peace walls or interfaces or housing demolitions today. Instead, I'm going to talk about a Belfast hotel, we can call that the monument, and some back alleys in Belfast, we can call that the everyday, but hopefully something of that hug carries across. Many of you will know the iconic Europa Hotel in Belfast. It was for a time the most bombed hotel in Europe, bombed an estimated 33 times during the 2 decades of the Troubles. It was designed and built before the Troubles, opening its doors in 1971, so its design was not trauma-informed. But what I find interesting is the ways in which it came to mean and act as many different things to different people through that time. For brevity here, I'll fly through those very quickly. But for starters, it was a symbol of modernism for Belfast at the time. It was built, loads of glass, very tall for Belfast. I think it was the tallest building in Belfast at the time at 13 stories. And so it became a highly visible and impactful target for the IRA. So first you have it as a symbol of modernism, then you have it as a target. And all that boarded up glass, it had a big impact when it got bombed, could be seen for miles around. That also got it the nickname the Hardboard Hotel for how often the windows were boarded up, and meant that it could be viewed from afar and people could look at it and get a feel for how bad things were in the city centre at a particular time. So in that way, it was something of a litmus test for the situation in the city. Nonetheless, the international press stayed in the hotel throughout. It was a convenient location. It had phones and TVs in rooms, which wasn't common at the time. And for them, ironically, it was a sanctuary, despite the trauma of all those bombs. That's Trevor McDonald walking across in the foreground in that photograph. Kind of emphasizes how symbolic it was as a target. Nobody ever died. The hotel never closed as a result of the bombs. The building was never destroyed. And the press felt safe there, or maybe it was just handy because they didn't even have to leave the building to get a story sometimes. And on that note, it became the place to get or tell a story, a sort of hotbed hangout space. And when peace talks got underway, it was the place that seen as a neutral territory where those talks could happen. It was the place that Bill Clinton famously stayed in 1995, leading journalist David McKittrick to refer to the hotel as the maternity unit for the peace process. Today, in its longevity, in surviving all of that, it's arguably a symbol of Northern Ireland's resistance, still very popular with locals and tourists alike. The place people still abseil down for charity, even though it's not the tallest building or even tallest hotel anymore. And it is right in the centre of this old Coke ad from about 20 years ago. There it is, slap bang in the middle of this ad, celebrating all of the things that are quintessentially Belfast. So a symbol of modernism, a target, a litmus test, a sanctuary, a hotbed for stories, a neutral territory for peace talks, a symbol of resilience, all that often simultaneously from one hotel building. This has led me to postulate elsewhere that the Europa Hotel is an unofficial, enduring, living monument or counter-monument, bear with me, to Northern Ireland's resilience and endurance through the Troubles, to the province's ability to pick itself up and get on with things at a time when any more tangible monument to the thousands of lives lost in the Troubles remains divisive. It's about remembering, but it's equally about forgetting and finding ways to move on. I don't have time to get into too much theory today, but for me, this chimes with James Young's writings on counter-monuments to the Holocaust. And one quick example I want to share is his observation about Horst Hoheisel's replacement fountain. It's replacement for the Ashprop fountain in Kassel in Germany that was destroyed because its donor was a Jew. It too was therefore a symbol that meant different things to different people. Instead of building a new fountain, Hoheisel inverted the replacement fountain into the ground, so it was invisible. That's his sketch in the middle and the result on the right. So Young observes, the sunken fountain is not the memorial at all. It is only history turned into a pedestal, an invitation to passers-by who stand upon it to search for the memorial in their own heads, for only there is the memorial to be found. Perhaps in its own small way, the Europa Hotel allows people to find their own memories of the conflict in their own heads, in their own time, their own way. So that was the monument, now for the everyday. This time it's a reflection on responses to the lived trauma of the recent pandemic as they panned out specifically in Belfast's prolific alleyways. Being a city that grew rapidly in the Industrial Revolution to become the biggest city in Ireland for a time, it has a lot of Victorian terraced houses, and these houses come with alleys out their back, originally for coal deliveries and bins, etc., and now still for bins and bikes and the occasional dogs. But some of these, such as Wildflower Alley, have begun to be transformed by residents into gardens even before the pandemic. That's Wildflower there. But with all the lockdown restrictions, the idea really took hold across the city, and many more alleys sprung up, called things like Lockdown Lane, Rainbow Alley, Eden Alley. People started coming together to grow flowers and food and whatever they had going spare. On the left there, you can just see a yellow planter made out of filing cabinet, and on the right has a bike helmet used to grow things. They made compost together, grew flowers, grew food, all of that, playing music, playing games. One alley in South Belfast held a sports day of sorts for the local children who were missing out on this in school, dubbed the 2020 Alleyway Athletics. I argue in my chapter that for many people, these alleyway activities have been part of a healing process through and after the pandemic. One frustrated artist missing the galleries even decided to curate a group exhibition in her own alleyway in October 2020. That's Maeve McElgorm in the middle and a piece of her work on the left. For a few hours, she invited people to interact with art in a way they had been missing. So this is various pieces of art from invited friends. The following year, this grew into something across several alleys with even more artists as part of the Imagine Belfast Festival, and was called Lemon Alley. Pieces that responded to both the pandemic and the conditions of the alley included a ceramic camera called Always Watching Over You by Patrick Cahoon, which is a double entendre that juxtaposes a delicate material with a utilitarian mass-produced object, simultaneously recalling his personal memory of his late grandmother, while also evoking and critiquing the sense of being under surveillance in public space. Also some delightfully whimsical newspaper seagulls by Donal Billings, and some installations and commissioned alley interventions by 9 Foot in Common, which is my own project with Amberly Neely, demonstrating how people could populate their alley with mirrors, benches and street art to transform it into a nice place to spend some time. The piece I want to talk about now, before I more or less finish up, is Anna Donovan's piece called By Your Absence, which is an installation of raw clay, slip painted canvas and red bricks that form the outline of a body on the concrete alley floor, evoking a crime scene. The suggested body was a void or absence, leaving only mud-like clay stains on a white canvas sheet surrounded by piled up raw clay leaves and the clay bricks from which most of Belfast and its alleys are built. The artist explained how the piece, which is in memory of her own late sister, Karen, evolved from the sense that memories of someone who has passed away means for as long as that memory is there, they haven't quite gone yet. Over the course of the 2-day exhibition, these clay leaves would have mingled with real leaves in the alley and got soggy in the rain, obscuring the figure and blurring the boundaries of the art with its surroundings, becoming a memory in real time. However, that wasn't to be, as within hours of its completion, before the exhibition even formally opened, the piece was anonymously destroyed, meaning that By Your Absence was absent itself from Lemon Alley. Acting quickly, the curators instead created a shrine of the piece on a wall beside what remained, so that it still had some presence in the exhibition. Anna, the artist, reflected that the piece had grown in meaning through this, saying, by their actions, those who destroyed the original work had inadvertently intensified its meaning. They represent the often unseen and incomprehensible reason for loss, and the shrine represents the dogged memory of those remaining. This occurrence, to me, speaks to the multi-layered reality of urban space, like the famous adage that states that in civil unrest, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So one person's hotel is another's target. One man's fountain is to another a threat, and an alley is a garden or exhibition space for some, and for others a clear route to get their bin or bike to and from their back gate. Often this multiple reading of the same shared space can lead to micro and not so micro conflicts, but it is arguably also where their potential lies. Healing takes place in different ways and timescales for different people. Spaces that can be multi-layered to allow that, like the many readings of the Europa Hotel through and beyond the Troubles, are the ways the alleys open themselves up to walking and gardening and art, and for that gardening and art to be responsive in real time to what's available and to the sometimes hostile conditions. of the alley, like the momentary solace of the hug, offer hopeful ways in which, hopeful examples of ways in which we can coexist in space and find comfort there as we collectively heal. That's all I have to say. And to finish, I was asked to pose a few questions, which I think we're going to discuss at the end after everyone else has spoken. But yes, for starters, I've described a mother's hug redefined as home for children witnessing their bricks and mortar home being destroyed. So a question for you is, what place or gesture captures trauma-informed placemaking for you? What can we as placemakers learn from these citizen-led reinterpretations of places that I've described? And how can we create or enable spaces that are plural and multi-layered? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aisling. There's something there that impressed on me as well, with that, particularly with the image of the hug. It's like the importance actually of the personal and the reflexive in this as well. But we can come back to that in the chat. Let's go straight into our next presentation. So over to Cara and Michal Huss.
Hi everyone, I'm going to begin and share my screen. Thank you so much for inviting us to speak and for everyone for being here. My name is Michal, and with Karen, we have contributed a chapter on anti-colonial placemaking to the volume. And we understand places as meaningful small worlds, inhabited by multiple lives responsible to each other, and the places in which they lived or live. For us, anti-colonial placemaking entails learning from and working in solidarity with people and places that experience chronic trauma. This means rejecting linear biographies of sites and engaging in creative memory work and place-based embodied practices that elicit emotional stories of survival, solidarity, and more just futures. Therefore, we suggest that as privileged spatial practitioners and thinkers, and in our case, non-Indigenous thinkers, we need to adopt approaches that facilitate learning from primary placemakers, which we understand as the inhabitants who shape these places through their daily lives, attachments, and memories across generations. In our talk today, we will describe two examples attentive to the existing ways in which places and people are wounded, and that also advance alternative geographical imaginaries and place-based narratives and healing. And I will begin with snapshots from my research that treats walking as an ethnographical learning approach. I will focus on tours of Jaffa for a mixture of Israeli, Palestinian, and international audiences that are led by internally displaced Palestinians who vocalize, make visible, and enact place-based stories of this chronically traumatized city. In these tours, we learn about the place-based trauma of the Nakba, which refers to the uprooting of Palestinians from their homeland to make space for the formation of the State of Israel over 78% of mandatory Palestine. The names, stories, cultures, and worlds associated with places were also occupied, and the remains of Palestinian cities such as Jaffa were dispossessed and emptied from their histories of socioeconomic advancement and cosmopolitanism. In 1951, Jaffa in Arabic, was violently annexed to Tel Aviv after being emptied of 95% of its Palestinian population. Resistance to the modern settler colonial city requires generating new ways of seeing, feeling, being, perceiving, and imagining a place. Through an embodied movement across the city, the tours that are facilitated by a variety of NGOs, as well as individual political activists, invite audiences to learn how places have been wounded by colonialism and apartheid, but also to imagine alternative futures of accountability and the return of Palestinian refugees. I will now describe different ways in which tour guides render the spatial temporal complexities of this place visible, embodied, and experienced. In the tours, Palestinian tour guides use ruins as fragmented specializations of history to retrace and erase Palestinian urbanity and challenge the Israeli national mythology and colonial domination. For instance, Hassan Bek Mosque, a permanent feature among the high-rise buildings of Tel Aviv, is the meeting point for a tour with 20 participants. Our tour guide Omar explains that the mosque was once the communal heart of Jaffa's coastal Manshia neighborhood, It is now amongst its only remnants that escaped the fate of the surrounding buildings that were largely destroyed in 1948 in result of the war and completely erased in subsequent waves of demolition as part of Israeli regeneration plans. Omar highlights how today, by preserving a few token traces, such as the mosque, Israel denies the systematic process of eliminating Palestinian homelands. We also visit ruins that are hardly identifiable to an untrained eye. As we walk along Tel Aviv's touristic southern seafront, we learn that the rocks used to create the area we are now standing on were taken from the mountains of ruins of the destroyed Mckeown neighborhood. Both stories of ruins demonstrate how architecture can be strategically used to thin out historical places and give the settler colonial planning imaginary a material presence. Indeed, learning from and about traumatized places means to acknowledge how places have been gentrified into tourist sites, into geopolitical territories, and into profitable districts. At the same time, through the tours, architectural features are transformed from passive landscapes for tourist consumption into living artifacts that generate a tension between past and present. We walk past a large tourist frame placed by the municipality to invite people to take a framed panoramic photo. Omar places a photograph of the Mckeown neighborhood that was violently erased from Tel Aviv's cityscape on top of the frame. Doing so temporarily rewrites the controlled urban tourist landscape and narrative. Tour participants photograph this gesture, forming a collage that links past and present, eraser, and commemoration. In the context of the Israeli systematic rewriting of the landscape, this cataloging of spatial elements also works as a future-oriented form of archiving. In other words, learning stories about a deeply cherished historical homeland offers more than stories about pain and violence. The tours are a form of resistance, commemoration, and survival. The tours better demonstrate how regeneration and gentrification continually abstract the places of Palestinian Jaffa into Israeli sites of consumption. In another tour, Yusuf, another tour guide, asks, "Have you heard of the old Jaffa hostel? Everyone loves it, but there is a sad story here of identity blurring, since it used to be a Palestinian home." As Yusuf explains, in Jaffa, the global process of gentrification has an added ethno-national dimension. He highlights there are no checkpoints in Jaffa and no Arabic and no history. And this rapid process of spatial altering is big. It's the Nakba, highlighting the inability to draw a clear line between multiple processes of ruination in Tel Aviv Jaffa, including war, post-war reconstruction, and gentrification, is a testament to the ongoing dispossession of Palestinian space within the Israeli Green Line. Blurred identity at the old hostel, former home, speaks to the ability of architecture to inflict violence. As such, the tours problematize the international assumption of a geopolitical conflict that has begun in 1967 and only occurs beyond the Green Line borders. They transgress oversimplified Western temporalities by performing with ruins to visualize an officially omitted history, as well as the ongoing history of its omission. Walking tours by primary placemakers suggest an anti-colonial mode of perceiving and imagining Jaffa as constituted by many thick places that involves learning from the past to imagine a future of accountability and return. And many of these tour guides end with reading a return document about the future return of Palestinian refugees. And I will now pass on to Karen.
Thank you, Michal. Anti-colonial placemaking practice includes learning from particular places, such as Jaffa, but also sharing local-to-local learning from other places and primary placemakers. What Henry Lefebvre describes as the violence of abstraction and planning also exists in post-colonial and imperialist cities. In the US, Mindy Thompson-Folila, for example, described the root shock that historic African-American communities experience resulting from waves of urban renewal beginning in the 1950s. Cherished homes, main streets, and neighborhoods were labeled as blighted, razed, and replaced with parking lots, motorways, hospitals, and universities serving predominantly white middle-class suburbanites. Legacies of those damaging processes remain. And even in the territories of colonial empires, such as the city of Manchester, these cities also have experienced cumulative effects of urban dispossession and renewal. Rachel Payne describes chronic urban trauma to consider place-based intergenerational, multi-temporal, and multi-scalar trauma. And so in our chapter, Michal and I draw upon theorists and practitioners such as these, as well as other Indigenous, feminist, Black, and queer practitioners who understand place as a small world inhabited by multiple lives. Mishwana Goman, Tonawada Band of Seneca, cites geographer Ifu Tuan to argue that places should be understood from the perspectives of the people who have given it meaning, and highlights Indigenous stories as the basis for knowledge, as well as resistance and resurgence. In post-colonial Ireland, one example of a project I have worked on in North Dublin was a story map in partnership with Irish travelers and geography researchers. Travelers were historically discriminated through the colonial 1634 Trespass Acts, with legacies in the post-colonial present, such as the 2002 Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act that criminalizes trespass, and thus the nomadic tradition of travelers. Acknowledged as an ethnic minority in 2017, Irish travelers continue to face systemic racism. Traveler researchers confronted the absence of locally significant places in this project by gathering and mapping stories about places across 3 generations. And the map centered on their homes rather than Kulak village, because official maps do not map traveler-specific accommodation. The large, colorful wooden community map of more than 65 places identified by the traveler community pictured here inverts dominant orientations and creates new relational geographies. The webpage that Bernadine just posted is, please look at, it's for the story map. It includes 2 digital maps based on the community map and depicts many stories that suggest a very complex situation. As non-travelers in the geography team, we learned a lot from traveler stories. We also learned from their mapping analysis in ways that reorients dominant understandings of the city and space, and through a place-based perspective invites us to listen to other people's tales that we may ourselves personally not have experienced, but need to learn from in order to challenge systemic racism. The story map has positive memories. Some stories describe respectful relationships with travelers and non-travelers, and other stories indicate systemic racism and mainstream society's responsibility for the harm resulting from discrimination. So to conclude, anti-colonial placemaking includes leadership by people experiencing systemic oppression with experience challenging and exposing spatial injustice. The perspectives of local peoples include different underlying philosophies about the places that people outside of a community may share. And if we draw upon Indigenous theorists and local experts, it means to consider places also not as irreparably damaged, but to offer environments for justice, healing, and rebirth. And so we are drawing with our questions at the end also from Max Liberaran, who also advances an anti-colonial approach to research of starting from a place of humility, acknowledging privilege, and begin with some simple ways of reflexive change, questions of change, so that you can change some of the structures and institutions where you work. So we have 3 questions here about attending to the thick stories of places. What can you do in your own practice and areas of jurisdiction to change any practices that don't support primary placemakers? And then also think through colonial or post-colonial or oppressive ways which you may have control over either at home or at work, and see how you can change and make it not like that way. Thank you very much. We'll end there.
I was just saying thank you very much, and a great presentation, and just struck between the mapping and the remapping, the representation and the re-presentation, and a lot of similarities within Ashleen's presentation about how a place can simultaneously be a target, a healing, a safe place, a difficult place, and how we build walls to feel secure, but at the same time those walls perpetuate our fear and trauma, as well as traumatizing others on the other side of the wall. So I think we're already starting to see very rich themes, and I love just how everyone can be a placemaker in our own place. and creating belonging.
Thank you both for that. Brian, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I am Brian from the Philippines, but I'm currently based in Lisbon, Portugal, doing my PhD in culture studies. Today, I'll share some reflections and explorations of the topic of creative place proofing and trauma-informed placemaking, a perspective from post-disaster Philippines. But I would like to take a moment to express my deepest gratitude to the Irish Architecture Foundation, and in particular, Cara and Anita, for inviting me to be part of this essential conversation. Very excited to share this virtual space with such an esteemed panel and audience. So before we proceed, I'd like to issue a warning. Our discussion and some images will delve into topics related to trauma, disasters, and community struggle, which can be very distressing for some, so feel free to step away if you need to. Just a quick backgrounder, the Philippines here is an archipelago situated in Southeast Asia, composed of more than 7,600 islands. It's characterized by diverse topography with mountainous regions, extensive coastlines, vast plains, and dense forests. This geographical diversity contributes to the richness of its natural resources and biodiversity, yet it also makes the country particularly vulnerable to various hazards. The country sits within the typhoon belt in the Western Pacific, making it highly susceptible to tropical cyclones. On average, the Philippines experiences about 20 typhoons on average each year, some of which cause widespread devastation and loss of life. Super Typhoon Haiyan, known in the Philippines as Super Typhoon Yolanda, was one of the most powerful tropical cyclones ever recorded in the world. The typhoon's impact was devastating, leading to more than 6,000 confirmed deaths, over 1,000 people missing, and about 14 million people affected across the country. The aftermath of Haiyan exposed the country's vulnerabilities and the vast socioeconomic disparities among its population. The country's extensive coastline also exposes it to risks associated with sea level rise and storm surges, particularly in the context of climate change. Furthermore, this photo, as you're seeing right now, is not an AI-generated photo. It's not a dystopian movie, but it's because it's located in the Pacific Ring of Fire, it makes the Philippines very prone to seismic activities, including frequent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The country is home to 23 active volcanoes, and earthquakes are a common occurrence due to the movement of several tectonic plates in the region. So this photo right here was the result of a volcanic eruption that happened close to our town just 2 months before COVID hit in 2020. So these factors, coupled with our exposure to these hazards and the frequency of these hazards leading to disasters, our vulnerability, susceptibility, lack of coping and adaptive capacities made the Philippines rank first into the World Risk Report in 2022. Built on the World Risk Index data, the 2022 report ranks 193 countries on their risk of experiencing disaster or vulnerability to extreme weather events, such as earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, and droughts. We must realize, however, that disasters are a product of both hazards and human failures combined. As disaster studies scholars argue, disasters will persist until we recognize that they stem from unequal access to resources and poor governance. In the Philippines, these issues are exacerbated by the nature of the state. We will never be truly resilient if this is the case. So these factors need to be considered in our placemaking strategies. So the Filipino spirit is waterproof, popularly known as the battle cry or unofficial slogan of Filipinos whenever we experience disasters, embodies the admirable resilience of Filipinos in the face of frequent typhoons. However, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it pays tribute to the strength and resilience of the Filipino people who, despite the adversities, managed to rise and rebuild their lives over and over and over again. It highlights the courage, unity, and hope that the Filipino spirit during such challenging times. But while it's amazing to see how strong the Filipino spirit can be in the face of disasters, we need to think about the potential downsides of this scenario. This narrative could accidentally make us overlook the political factors that make these disasters worse for people who are already struggling. When we talk so much about resilience, we might forget about the need for those in power to take responsibility and to plan better to reduce the risk and impact of these disasters. So while it's great that Filipinos are so resilient, we should not let this become a tool to make us ignore the need for action from the responsible institutions. Both the strength of everyday people and the responsibility of institutions are needed for a fair and long-lasting approach to managing disasters. Also, the Philippine government treats natural hazards as the enemy and the root cause of disaster that must be stopped and fought against, relying on military chains of command. This rather defensive, combative, and reactive nature must shift to proactive measures, believing that the underlying social, cultural, economic, and political causes of vulnerability are not usually viewed as military or civil defense matters. So disasters should be seen as extensions of permanent emergency situations, not as isolated incidents. The response requires more than just top-down control. Our policies should make sense of and value community knowledge, their sociocultural beliefs, practices, and resources. I think we all agree and strongly echo in this virtual room that communities are very key, are very crucial to engagement, among other things. The local knowledge of communities often gets overlooked in favor of globally applicable scientific findings, leaving gaps in knowledge integration. So how can we better embed this understanding in our placemaking efforts? Here lies the concept of creative place proofing. So creative place proofing combines trauma-informed and creative placemaking to foster resilience in communities affected by disasters. It recognizes the profound impact of trauma on people and places and leverages arts and culture to promote healing and empowerment. So the approach is careful not to romanticize resilience, instead urging for transparency, accountability, and equitable policies. It aims to transform vulnerabilities into strengths by tapping into the unique characteristics of each community. With no one-size-fits-all solution, place proofing encourages participatory decision-making to ensure solutions are locally endorsed and culturally relevant, leading to resilient, adaptable spaces that enhance our well-being. So how are communities valued in the Philippines? The term bayanihan symbolizes the spirit of communal unity or effort to achieve a particular objective. Historically, the term was used to describe a traditional Filipino custom where community members would help a family move to a new location. The process involved literally carrying the family's entire house to its new location. This was done by putting bamboo poles, forming a strong frame to lift the stilts from the ground, and carrying the whole house with the men positioned at the ends of each pole. While this traditional practice isn't as common in modern times, the term has expanded to refer to a spirit of communal work and cooperation for the benefit of the community. So the power of creative place proofing lies in its ability to integrate the dynamism of places with the concept of proofing. It views places not as static entities, but as evolving communities that interact with and influence their environment in varied ways. As we move forward, we must rethink our notions of resilience and placemaking, shifting from a top-down approach to a more inclusive strategy that values local knowledge and experiences. Our goal should be not just to survive disasters, but to transform our vulnerabilities, our trauma into strengths. So as I conclude this presentation, let us ponder over or reflect over these questions. How does your current placemaking practice consider and address the systemic vulnerabilities and inequalities that exacerbate the impact of disasters? In what ways can we expand our understanding of placemaking to encompass not just physical spaces, but also the social, political, and cultural dynamics that define them? And lastly, how can we make placemaking a collaborative process that empowers communities, ensures accountability from institutions, and promotes a just and sustainable future? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's kind of hard not to be silenced by those images and by those statistics. And I hope this doesn't sound too glib, the two things that I'm going to say, but in 2020, I saw this word syndemic, and I was like, oh, that's a new word. What does that mean? Oh, okay, the compound disasters that we're all living with, with various forms of injustice and climate emergency. It's like, wow, great new word. And I also do a lot of work with people here in the UK and in the US that talk about place narratives and just how positive that word is. Place narrative, it's a celebratory thing. It's a very one-dimensional take on it like that. And your mention of place narrative in that sense, and the Filipino spirit is not waterproof, and just how the double-edgedness of that. And I think there's a really great thing that you've added into this discussion as well around that place proofing as well. That's a really interesting and I think an important concept for us to hold. Thank you very much. Did you want to add anything, Anita?
You're on mute, Anita.
By the end of the session, I'll have it sorted. I love the foregrounding. I think it's really important to really highlight that it is not always the community's responsibility, and they should not be subsidizing state and national agencies' work. Yes, we're in this together, but actually there are different responsibilities that need to be addressed. And I think that's really important. It often gets overlooked. Yay, we're resilient. It's like,
yeah,
we have no choice.
Exactly.
I think the other thing that's really important too is, yes, there's a creativity, and increasingly people are talking about post-traumatic growth, but I think we also have to be really mindful of toxic positivity. There are times when you have been traumatized, you need to heal before people start talking to you about post-traumatic growth. And I think that's really important as well. So
brilliant. Thank you very much. Let's go over to our last panelists, last speaker for the day. And it's really great that, thank you to everybody for keeping to time, because it means those of you that can only spend an hour with us get to, you do get to hear everybody speaking. So over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you so much to the Foundation and our fearless book editors for shepherding us through this process. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. My name is Jeff Poulin, and I am pleased to be here today to share a little bit of work, a multi-year research initiative, and the outcomes of that, which fall into place with this book title. I myself am a teaching artist, an education researcher, and social entrepreneur based in Washington, D.C. in the United States. Although I will say, having spent a lot of time in Ireland in my graduate studies. My talk today is around trauma-informed placemaking by and for creative youth. I work for an organization called Creative Generation, and we wholeheartedly believe that youth create change. We're a values-driven global collective who collaborate both with young creatives and those who are committed to cultivating their creativity, ideally towards taking local actions for global changes in pursuit of a more just world. I fully recognize the Piscataway and the Anacostan nations, whose territory I am currently placed on and where our office is located, and we wish to both acknowledge, respect, and uplift the elders of those nations, both past, present, and emerging. During the next 10 minutes or so, I hope to share some findings from this research, which examined how young creatives are driving social change around the world, that we're going to intertwine some of those learnings that were derived from youth researchers and documentarians, specifically examining their place and arts-based community development efforts. And finally, to present some youth-derived models for planning, implementation, and evaluation that could be relevant in your work. This initiative was originally commissioned in March 2020 by Art Place America. For those unfamiliar, Art Place America was a 10-year, multi-million-dollar initiative from a consortium of funders to examine creative placemaking. Over those 10 years, though, the definition of placemaking changed, the debates, fierce debates about placekeeping, and so forth were had, and they looked primarily at multiple sectors, such as the civic, social, and faith sector, commercial, government, nonprofit, and philanthropic, across a number of different elements of community life. And of course, in the last 6 months, they got around to youth development, where Creative Generation was brought in, and myself as the principal investigator on the project began to design a study over the course of 2020 pre-pandemic. Alas, that project was halted and re-examined in a new facet to explore what impacts young creatives have on their communities. That was the research question, from which we designed a study that complemented the local knowledge of local youth community development people, creative placemakers, young creatives, as we ended up calling them, in 9 communities across the United States from different areas of focus, such as safety and belonging, immigration, food, youth empowerment, education reform, and so forth. Some of these I want to share with you to uplift the types of work that they were doing in what we called creative youth development and creative placemaking, such as performing statistics in Richmond, Virginia, one of the sites in the United States that has the highest youth incarceration rates. They use creative place-based projects to elevate the experience of formerly incarcerated young people using the arts to devolve the youth incarceration system, ultimately leading to advocacy for the elimination of youth incarceration. The Cheyenne River Youth Project in South Dakota embeds in Indigenous knowledge the creative placemaking efforts of young people to create the homeland that they wish to see in the future. One Hood Media in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania uses music and performance art, such as rap and hip hop, to drive conversations about the Black Lives Matter movement in communities most affected. Free Street Theater engaged in devised theater productions to explore water and sewage, and creating a community with safe drinking water and proper sewage measures to create the city that young people wanted to see. And finally, one that we'll spend just a little more time on was Dancing Grounds, Dance for Social Change in New Orleans, Louisiana, which put on a site-specific dance festival, elevating youth's concerns about gentrification and displacement, particularly in the wake of Hurricane Katrina a decade on. They took this house that you see here and created this dance festival involving a number of different decision makers, from the city planning council to local philanthropists, members of the community leadership, and so much more, in order to showcase what they thought was the most pressing issue of their time. Here, I'm going to show you a video, a promotion that was created by these young people called Solastalgia, which is the production they put on to garner social change in their community using their art form of dance.
City for sale, folks. Culturally beautiful city with a big part in tourism industry. City for sale, folks. Hot city, come and get it, come and get it, come and get it. We can make space for you. We raise property values. We push out the locals, we push out the poor, we push out the black. Come and watch this new spectacle. We offer you the new minstrel. Beads, beignets, boudin, we have it all. Feast on savory gumbo, succulent spicy crawfish, jumping jambalaya. Feast on the culture, folks. City for sale, city for sale, city for sale, folks. Hot city, come and get it. Come and get it, come and get it, come and get it. It's like parades and succulents every day in New Orleans, folks. Space is limited. Move in now.
So you'll see in that that example from Dancing Grounds in New Orleans that there are various elements of civic design, of social change, and of artistic performance that these young people explored over a 2-year time period. And I share that example of the many that we looked at to dive deeper actually into the answers to the questions. So what we did in this process was we collaborated with young people and their teaching artist companions to be those researchers and documentarians specifically about the impact that young creative placemakers had in their communities. And they came up with several answers. They're here in bullets, but I want to share with you what the video production team, made up of young people in Boston, Massachusetts, actually came up with using the voices of participants from around the country.
To describe the program, it's a place where like youth and like not just youth, but teachers can come together and learn from each other.
This program truly values the voices of young people. It's not censored. We're taking what they're saying, their thoughts, their voices.
If we want to see us as a collective growing stronger by the day, we have to see ourselves as individuals grow stronger every day.
The team very adamant about like pausing the work to lean into like the relationships that are in the space.
With that creative expression, I think what we would see is happier people, happier communities.
And I, again, share this to elevate the voices of those young people and to really specifically share those outcomes, because that is what we hope to achieve in all of our work. I like to hope. But what we actually learned from this process was that it was about collaboration. What made this creative placemaking, arts-based, place-based social change efforts led by young people was really about how we worked in community, not in the community, but in community, as one young person said here, that they could go it alone and have some impact, go it together with other youth and have more. But when they worked in community with adult allies, such as civic designers, social planners, and more, that their impact was exponential. In fact, these young people, through their various artistic forms, articulated different realms of impact, of how their creative process with teaching artists, how their community embedded projects, that dark blue circle, had impact, and then how it rippled out into the community. If you take that one example from New Orleans, they were able to change the redlining zoning laws that took effect after Hurricane Katrina and caused more and more rippling trauma. But instead, they used their dance, their theatrical performance, in order to bring about realizations from a number of stakeholders that you see in the outermost realms here. What was interesting, though, for us as a collective of educators and researchers was specifically about how we as adults can make this happen in our own practice. What was it that actually helped address these traumas, be it the killing of civilians at the hands of police and vigilantes in Pittsburgh, the trauma of climate catastrophes like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, or the man-made crisis of youth incarceration in Richmond, Virginia, or the legacy of oppression on reservations in South Dakota. What we knew from our previous research, though, was that these successful creative youth development programs viewed themselves as civic institutions versus just cultural institutions, deeply embedding in communities. Further, we knew that there were public policies and the deep integration of pedagogy and social and civic practice that brought about youth understanding of self and community and the world, and in fact created a flywheel effect of social change. So through these lenses, we went back to the data that was collected, aggregated, and displayed by these youth researchers and examined it for the pedagogical implications. Really, what was it about the design of these programs? And this is where the relevance to this book comes in. It was about trauma-informed practice, that the educators, be they teaching artists, school counselors, educators, or more, talked specifically about the public policy and the philanthropy around community development, which empowered the creative youth development, this pedagogical practice that allowed the artistic and creative development of young people, which was deeply informed and integrated into what they referred to as the practice. Here they were referencing trauma-informed practice, healing practice, and restorative justice practices. And as we looked through the data, there were several elements around recognizing historical injustice and disrupting cycles and systems. Looking towards local, indigenous, queer, feminist knowledge that would help the healing of a community that was focused in wellness and well-being. And finally, towards that end goal of systemic change was around restorative justice practices, repairing harm through actions, and empowering young people to lead these efforts into the future. And that's really where the relevance comes in. We as the adults, as the creative placemakers, educators, and more, have a responsibility to deeply embed our practice in trauma-informed healing and justice-oriented approaches. We have to think of it as pedagogy so that the programs that are run for youth can actually be run by youth, and how our placemaking in the world can actually change our communities for the better for generations. And when young people were exploring the impacts of this type of pedagogy, they described it as a multitude of sectors that must all work together. That we actually have different dimensions of impact on place, on community, and on experiences. And finally, they put forward a theory of change that can guide us adults to think of our projects in a new way, that really center these creative youth and community development projects, but work towards different outcomes in youth development, social, or place. And it really gives us some new language to think about, in the eyes of young people, what the potential is for this type of work. So the questions that I leave you to ponder here today are to think about the different ways in which young people are socially or institutionally embedded in your placemaking practices. What barriers often exist, and how can we overcome them? And finally, imagine the possibilities. Think about what could happen if young people were crafting those policies or allocating the funding. What would actually happen in our neighborhoods or communities or countries? Thank you.
Fabulous, Jeff, and I'm sure for anyone who knows me, very dear to my heart. I think something that I will mention in response to that, our research that we completed here in Ireland, out of our core cohort, we worked with 1,400 students. Within that, we had a core cohort of 75 and 91% of that cohort that we had for an academic year told us that they were worried about their future, not because it was going to be good or bad, but because they didn't think they had one, which is quite a stark. So from that, we have been working with them, and we've been developing pedagogical resources that integrate social, environmental, and economic praxis, as well as arts-led design thinking, circular design thinking, and it can be taught by any teacher so that we can scale quickly. Because I think for those young people, they are dealing with the legacy of all of us adults. And they're going to have to be the ones, sadly, I don't agree with it. I think it's really sad, but they're going to have to be the ones that will be making the change for the world that they will inhabit, but also the world that they want to live in. So the threat and the opportunity, and they really need support, and they need us as allies. So thank you for the work you're doing. It's fantastic.
Really great. That was really powerful, really powerful. And I think with all of this, you also, all of what you've said as well, and going back to some of the aims that we have with this project, it's about questioning what is our role as placemakers. And I think, quite often I'm struck when I'm working with younger people, as somebody, several years down in my practice, it's a cliche to say I'm learning from them, but how am I here to use my experience to elevate what they're doing? And I love that word that you use there, Jeff. I struggle with the word enable and empower and things like that, but to elevate what they're doing already. And if placemaking is a really inclusive practice, then, that has to include young people's voices as well as really equal in this. But I think and you're right, Anita, with an awareness that they are going to bear a very different responsibility to us as they go forward in their lives, unfortunately. Shall we open this out to some more general conversation now? I wonder if our panelists have questions of each other, or things that they want to comment on across each other. I think there's a lot of cross-cutting themes there between what you were talking about. And we can go back to their individual questions, we can look at those and address those specifically or in the round. And we encourage you also to put all of your thoughts and questions in the chat, and we can come to you as well to draw you into the conversation actively too.
Just to quickly say that I found the other talks really, really fascinating, and just what a topic. It's so wide-reaching, and yet so many common threads. And yeah, it's a very inclusive term that kind of includes anything anybody wants it to mean within their practice, which is wonderful. I really look forward to reading all of your chapters and the others in the book when it comes out. So
I'm particularly excited about the diversity of contributions, and also as well the contributions that are coming forward and the insights for practitioners. I think it's so diverse, and the knowledge that's held within every chapter, to have it all in one textbook. And this is really important. As a textbook, it's more accessible than a standard academic text. And I think that in combination with the website, gives us all more tools to really integrate into our practices, because I think the scale of what we will be facing from wherever it comes from, whether it's the physical world, conflict, natural disasters, it's going to take, as they say, all the talents and the inclusion of multiple perspectives and a circular leadership as well. I think it's not going to be top down or bottom up, it's going to be inside out.
Actually,
I think there's
sorry, go ahead, Cara.
No, you absolutely go for it, Brian. I can come back to what I was going to say.
Right. I felt like even the physical, the book itself is indeed probably a form of healing in itself. Like that book itself, which is it's a process of, collective storytelling where different experiences, from very much diverse backgrounds are gathered, shared and respected. So by just by providing a platform for these narratives, so the book validates the experiences of individuals and communities that have been affected by trauma, which is a crucial step in the healing process. So yeah, it's really such a crucial, a very important project.
Thank you. That's right. We had no idea, just a very personal moment. We really had no idea that when we put, the conversation that started with Anita and I sat on our respective sofas, me in Brighton, Anita in Kerry 2 years ago, what would come from this. And it's been amazing, the responses that we've had from people. So thank you very much. Karen, you had your hand up.
Yes, and I also just want to say that a question just came in, so I'll try to make this brief. But again, thank you for these fabulous presentations and inviting us to be part of the project. I really love the fact that across the presentations, both this idea of in community that was introduced to us by the young people that Jeff was collaborating with, as well as the fact that places are not seen as property, as owned, as geopolitical territory. And here it's just my bias as a geographer, but I think this is the single biggest stumbling block that we have to somehow communicate to practitioners as well as government official and policymakers. So just a small comment, and of course, there's an incredible richness of Indigenous theory, as well as queer, Black, and other practitioners that emphasize also a kind of place-based pedagogy, as well as all of the different forms of knowledges. So I think the humility means to get rid of a category of expertise, professional placemaking. And so in that way, the inside outness that Anita is talking about, I think has to be coming from the places and the peoples. So thanks.
Karen, I'm just going to build off of that, and I think then we can move to the question that was posed. But I think, that the biggest takeaway, which was fascinating, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but as we presented our findings to the largest funders in the United States, representing the vast majorities of wealth, what we realized is that the very act of what we were forced to do in COVID, that turning it inside out, empowering young people to be the experts, was the biggest takeaway. Forget all the models, forget the evaluation tactics, forget, the theories of change and design. It doesn't matter. It was the fact that we literally said the local expertise, and in the case of young people, of those under the age of 18, was the most powerful. And to Brian's point earlier, what was interesting is they all looked outside of the United States for answers to their solutions. So, or answers to their challenges, where young people that were grappling with recovery from climate crisis events were looking to the Pacific Ring, the folks that were grappling with long-term issues from the Atlantic slave trade were looking to the, Bristol in the United Kingdom. Like, it was a really interesting example of what we hope to do here, I think, which is to cross-pollinate and solutionize the way that we can approach trauma, especially in the last 3 years. And to draw one other line here, and I can put the link in the chat here, but we also did a parallel project at the same time looking at leadership within the arts, cultural, and creative education sector. And one of the biggest outcomes of that was sort of the great democratization of how we get rid of those who are deemed knowledgeable and instead elevate that hyper-localized experience as knowledge bearing. And I think if you smash those two together, we perhaps, I might argue, as maybe I did in the chapter, that's the path forward for the future of our sector.
Great stuff. Anya, you have a question.
So it was more really, I'm hesitating to switch on my camera because I'm just out of hospital, so I'm not looking my best. But it was more a comment rather than a question. And I seem to be having difficulty with pasting in much more of what I wanted to say. So there's a slight contradiction in when I visited Palestine about witnessing the resourcefulness. And actually I'd written down resilience, but that's not the word I want to use, because there's quite a strong body of work that's coming through from Palestine that we look at the work of Sama Jabir, psychiatrist there, and Malaka Janir, I think her name is, both work in the West Bank and in Gaza. And in their work, they will talk about the description or the concept of resilience actually can be a form of oppression, because it colludes with the oppressor and the type of continuous oppression, and that it denies a community, a country, an ethnic group the right to resist in a way which is not about being superhuman, about digging into a resilience which doesn't actually speak to the full truth. So it's an interesting and new concept about challenging the piece around resilience. So I just wanted to bring that in, and thoughts around that, and just to put a different spin in the picture.
Anya, I'll go ahead and just jump in and say what I loved working with these young people most was that they would say things, if you notice the dimensions of impact is like almost the next evolution from that Rand report in the 90s, about the social impact of the arts. And the same thing, they literally said, that ageism is in fact the only acceptable oppression these days, and that young people are constantly oppressed from systems, and they're called resilient, and it's like, but you built the system to literally exclude us.
Yes.
Which was a fascinating take on what you're talking about through the lens of age. And I think you're spot on in looking at even the traumas that come from that lineage that must be restored through those justice-oriented approaches, in my opinion.
Yeah. I sort of view it as it's a different type of resourcefulness and resilience that's coming through, but we just need to pay close attention to how the power of oppression is phenomenally powerful and invidious, and we have to be nearly continuously 2 or 3 steps ahead about what healing might look like, and is that healing a type of submission, a type of oppression that doesn't speak to the full truth of what has happened. So just some thoughts.
Very important, Anya, and thank you for contributing. I think it's really important as well. What we're excited about too is, I noticed in your comment, you were coming from the perspective of a psychotherapist. And I think that's really important because I know in my own journey, really beginning to understand how trauma works. And how it operates, and how it does not need to be big T trauma. We are all wired for security.
Yes.
And anything that begins to challenge that, even if it could seem small, kicks into that older brain, the amygdala, the limbic system. We don't have access to our frontal cortex, but also it can tip us back in to previous trauma. And then we're in that dynamic of chronic trauma as well. And I think more and more understanding that is a thing for all of us, I think really begins to shift how we practice and helps more with a vigilance perhaps. So thank you. I can see that Martin would like to comment, and then maybe Brian might like to come back in and pick up with Anya's in terms of place proofing and the resilience piece, but I think if you go to Martin first.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. Martin, indeed. Thank you.
How are you? No, it's just quite interesting, and we're looking at trauma and trauma of place. And in Kilkenny at the moment, the old Smithwick's Brewery, they're building it up into a beautiful technological park and all kinds of things that the community can participate in. But they have a big, beautiful advertising hoarding going around, running the perimeter of the site. And I was walking down by the river in the River Nore in Kilkenny with a friend of mine who's not from Kilkenny originally, and she was just saying, look at that. And I said, what? To see those hoardings, those people, the images they have of young white people with very few children and no older people and no diversity. And she, coming from a non-white background, it really struck her. And when we're looking at things like trauma and trauma of place, like, she was disempowered. There was no sense of collaboration for her as a citizen of Kilkenny. Is this something that's a laziness on the developers who put up these hoardings, or whoever designs the outer, I suppose, the preamble before the build? Or is it there to influence potential people who may be going to move into it? You know, I was quite shocked that it's not something that I noticed myself. It had to be pointed out to somebody, even though being an older male, I wasn't represented on the hoarding either. But it's like trauma, preempting the trauma, and then not being very inclusive before you even start anything at all. So that's my...
There's, I pick up on, maybe there's a shared cynic between the two of us there, Martin. I would love to say, oh, it's just laziness, because that's a slightly better option. I live in Brighton, which is, you know, it's known to be a very diverse city, and it's known to have a very, you know, substantial gay, queer, non-binary population. And we had some hoardings exactly the same go up on a development. And it was a very monocultural representation there. And the thing was, they didn't have any same-sex couples there. That was the most sort of visibly obvious thing. And there was a huge throwback to the developer on this. And they had to go back and rebrief, because their original brief obviously wasn't good enough, but rebrief those CAD farms that just churn out these images all the time to do something that was more representative of Brighton. Now, for that to happen, it got into the local news and a campaign started and all the rest of it. So Anita, you were sort of saying earlier about capital T trauma and small t trauma, that may be in a small t trauma category, but it was certainly something there in terms of Brighton's place identity, its place narrative, that was really excluding. And at some point, somebody made a decision along the line that that image was okay to go, whether it was from their own laziness or whether it was because they were really trying to attract a certain group of people. It didn't come out in the wash. Karen, you think it's quite intentional? As I'm being too generous to say it's just laziness.
No, I would totally agree, because I was recently there, Martin, myself, and local people living there were not engaged in any kind of participatory process. And this is actually part of the problem of the professionalization and planning, which kind of goes after development, and especially international funders. It's not prioritizing the housing needs of people. I mean, we have a massive homelessness and housing crisis, as you know. So a problem is calling participatory practice, like advertising in the newspaper or maybe inviting somebody to the table. That's very colonial and very patronizing, and so I think others are offering other possibilities. But I don't know if Brian Jay wants to come in at this point also, in terms of the question of resilience, which is a little bit back to the former discussion.
Right. Well, just to add to the comments of Anya and Jeff. In the context of the Philippines, for instance, the recurring disasters, which really comes in and out, like typhoons in the Philippines will be what, like average 20, 25 in a year. So more or less once every 2 weeks, but that's oversimplification, but just to establish that it really happens a lot. So the recurring disasters and this resilience narrative have become part of the cultural and political landscape, and they really shape how communities interact with their environment and each other. So this is all before the whole, COVID, and then that resilience is, becoming trendier, and this whole Build Back Better slogan. So even before that, I feel that this resilience narrative that the Filipino spirit is waterproof is really used as a smokescreen by those in power to divert attention from the inadequacies in disaster preparedness and disaster mitigation and disaster response. So it really shifts the burden of survival and recovery into the victims. And it obscures the systemic failures. It really hides the systemic failures that increase their vulnerability in the first place. So while Filipino resilience and Filipinos are very much intertwined, and Filipino spirit is very commendable and very crucial for survival, it should not be weaponized to perpetuate complacency, inaction among institutions responsible for disaster risk reduction and management. So both resilience, I guess, at the grassroots level and accountability at the institutional level should merge. They are very essential for a sustainable approach, I guess, to disaster management.
I think I'd also, thank you, Brian, like to try and build a bridge between Martin's comment and the discussion around resilience, because I think it does run the spectrum from laziness and ignorance, as in unaware, not engaged. It is a pattern, right up to, yes, it is intentional. Because I think one of the things that has been so separated. And I know we're saying resilience is a contentious word, but a lot of developers and a lot of the placemaking, place branding, etc., is operating on economic resilience. You know, and we used to joke when I lived in Deptford in South London, where there was 150 languages spoken. And at that time, it was going under some of the most intense regeneration in any part of London. And we used to walk around laughing and seeing these artist representations, like the hoardings and the advertising of the new building and what people were doing. And oh, look, there's our new friends who don't look like any of the friends that we have that live here. And I think this is something, you know, in terms of, say, a creative approach. Creative approaches can create the space for something else to happen, for new narratives, but they can also reinforce old narratives. And as Martin was saying, you know, it is already oppressing people before there's even, you know, a sod has been turned, a shovel has been dug. And there's I think this is something particularly within the built environment that moving forward, I think we have to begin to develop ways that are social, environmental, and economically just. You know, not so much about resilience and bouncing back. They should be just, and then maybe the need for that bounce back could become less. And we always move beyond this, oh, you must be superhuman, you must pick yourself up, you must, like, why should I? I'm really hurting right now. I just need to collapse, and I need to be held while I'm allowed to collapse. I think that's really important. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that need to support and hold as we go forward.
Anita, I thank you for those comments. And I just want to underscore, like, if I had a highlighter, I would highlight the words coming out of your mouth of intentional. That was one thing that through this research project in the US was around intentional design, which is why we actually chose the modality of a non-project specific theory of change to say, this is actually how those most affected, closest to the center, whatever, say we should do it. So let's use that as our starting point. And I think that in the case of our work around the intersection with education and youth development, that intentionality forms pedagogy. But again, as the case that I make in the chapter, I wonder about, is there a pedagogical approach to that whole dialogue around engagement? You know, how can we perhaps create processes that are more educational in a setting versus inviting them to the table or conducting research and, you know, harvesting perspectives? That's too harsh. But if it really was a communal space, there's a lot we could learn from education.
Absolutely. And I think working, like Cara mentioned it earlier, I think working a lot with young people. I've as a practicing artist, I have always worked in informal and formal learning, because that's one of the way, you know, artists tend to work, particularly if you're not that interested in a gallery system. And I would say I have probably learned more from the people that I work with than I have ever learned really through the professional training that I had. Certainly for the work that I really aspire to do. I think there was one question to Aisling. Has the community building in the alleyways continued since COVID? Has there been any more around breaking down the walls in Belfast?
Yeah, so the use of the alleys as gardens and social spaces has continued, does continue, although perhaps with less of the intensity that during the pandemic, when it was the only space people had that there was. In terms of bringing the walls down, that's a much more difficult thing to do. when the people that live there, living in the trauma of the shadow of the wall, don't want them to come down. And we did, in our practice, did an engagement piece a few years ago where we went around one of the longest 750-meter long one. We were tasked with doing engagement around the residents whose houses back onto this very high wall that I think I had in a photograph on one of the first slides, and asking them what they'd like to happen to the wall. And very complicated. You're told to have different meetings on different sides of the wall with different people, you know, not even to bring them all together. So we hired a vintage camper van and drove around the wall and displayed our ideas and drawings on it, and had a sort of creative happening and craft activities to break down that barrier of being, so that there was an ephemeral shared experience in a way. But there are very mixed feelings, people who don't want those walls to come down, or people who do, but not now. So I feel like we're going to be talking about that for a long time, because it's not something that can be done without the buy-in of the people it most affects.
And building trust is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we're close to time, so I'd just like to invite any panelists that haven't spoken yet to speak, and if there's anyone in the audience who would like to put in a final question, I'll go to the panelists first, if that's okay, and then
I guess thank you everyone. It was just fascinating, and I wanted to say something about the importance of the interdisciplinary debate that we're bringing into the conversation, but also something about the scale and the way in which we're on the one hand talking about these really kind of prolonged colonial oppressions or disasters, but also about dancing in the streets and alleyways and walking. And I think there's something really important about bringing all of this together and thinking from the really small and everyday as a way of tackling these supposedly untackable issues.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you. There's some great comments in the chat, and I'd like to thank everyone who came and everyone who contributed and everyone who listened, and just really say, please feel free to reach out. You know, myself and Cara feel very strongly this is not the definitive, this is the beginning of a global conversation that we can all be part of and contribute to and grow. So yeah, I'll hand over.
Thank you to everybody that joined us today, and thank you for your lovely kind comments there to all of the panel here today. There is a lot to think about. There's a huge amount to ponder, and as Anita said, we're kind of on the beginning of this journey in this sense with that. And thank you massively to IAF for hosting us and giving us this platform to, you know, for us to have this conversation, and, you know, the conversation will continue. So yeah, really, really lovely to have so many of you today. Really lovely to see our panelists today and those chapters to really come alive through what they were speaking. And thank you everybody for their contribution.
Yeah, I could just see one more question. Yes, Phyllis Kennedy, there is some lesson plans that we have around, some of it more around eco-anxiety, as well as moving towards values-led approaches to young people. What we saw in our work was, it was for them, it was actually giving them the skills and competencies and confidence for them to begin to affect change and have agency. So I can follow up with you on that, Phyllis, if you want.
Phyllis, I can assure you, Anita does have the lesson plans.
Works in
There's a fair
progress.
amount that they can follow up with.
And I'm sure Jeff would have some as well. I can put Jeff in touch as well.
Great,
So,
thank you.
Thank you, everyone, again.
Thanks. Before we go, I just want to say thank you again to our guest curators and all our speakers. It was fantastic. It is a beautiful evening here in Ireland, so we're going to probably all go out and enjoy the sun. I've shared a couple of links into our websites in the chat if you want to find out more about what we do, but also definitely keep an eye out for this book coming out. It's really going to be really important for all of us doing this work in placemaking. Thank you so much.